Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity project. I'm just doing a video on inflation and the potential for our indexed currency. Now, just to introduce the Nations of Sanity project for anyone who's not familiar with it, this project is based on the assertion that crime and therefore also law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. And that's the Nations of Sanity project in a nutshell and pretty much in its totality. So any additional ideas that I speak of on top of that basic solution that's presented are kind of optional extras. They're not definitionally part of the Nations of Sanity project. The only thing that the Nations of Sanity project is truly defined by, what is written in stone, for want of a better expression, is the idea that we should establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a universal peace agreement. And that, we assert, would provide the foundation of sanity and a coherent basis for freedom and rights upon which we can then build a better society and live any kind of life that we choose, really. But once we have that foundation that the Nations of Sanity looks to provide, there's still the question of, well, what do we want to do with that freedom? What do we want to do with those rights? How do we want to create or improve our society? And one of the things that needs addressing is money, our currency. I think most people that know anything about it would agree that our current money system is farcical to the point of criminal. Anyone familiar with inflation understands that it's essentially just another form of theft. The government obviously robs us through taxation, where they literally take our actual money. But through inflation, the governments and banks, central banks, are able to rob us in a more stealthy way, where they don't actually physically take our money, but what they do by printing more money is take the value out of our money. So they're kind of robbing us in another way. Now, for me, the solution to this, and a lot of solutions have obviously been presented. There's been obviously blockchain currencies, cryptocurrencies, things like that. And while many of these things like Bitcoin have a lot of elements that make them appealing, and I can certainly understand why people prefer Bitcoin with its increasing value over fiat currency that's guaranteed to forever decrease in value. The fact of the matter is none of these things are solutions either. For me, what seems to be the most obvious and self-evident solution, and what our money really needs to be, and what currency really needs to be to serve that purpose, is it needs to hold a stable value. And the only way for that to really happen is to have an indexed currency. Now, anyone who's familiar with an indexed pension would probably understand what I mean when I say an indexed currency. But just to kind of break it down, if you have a currency that's, say, for example, backed by gold, when we had the gold standard and our money was backed by gold, then the value of our money was tied to the value of gold. And obviously, it would fluctuate as the price of gold fluctuated. But people who are familiar with an index pension, or even just how we calculate inflation itself, will understand that we can create a truer value rather than having a currency backed by a single commodity like gold. An index currency would be backed by a cross-section of commodities, just like how an index pension is calculated based on a cross-section of commodities to find that true value. So any individual commodity will fluctuate in price and go up and down, is in accordance with the market. But there you can establish a true value by using a cross-section of different commodities. And that's basically how index pensions are calculated. So anyone who is lucky enough to have an index pension understands that while inflation may devalue the money that they're given, the money they're given will increase in accordance with that inflation, so that they are still getting the same amount of true money, the same true value. So anyone who says, for example, that we can't have a stable currency, or because there is no such thing as a true value, really needs to look into index pensions, because that seems to me one way in which a true value is calculated and ascertained. And I don't see any obvious reason why we can't do that with currency. And as that would as a currency that's serving a true purpose, it seems to me what we want our money to be is a representation of value. And money that really serves that true purpose is money that holds the same value. You want £10 or $10 or whatever currency you're operating in. You want that to be worth the same today as it was 10 years ago and as it will be in 10 years' time. You want that stability. As much as cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin can be appealing for the fact that people can make a lot of money on them by the fact that they increase in value, they're not really serving as a currency. They're more acting like a commodity that people can invest in. Whereas for an actual currency that we can use, because if we think about what money is, or what it originally was meant to be, it was really just supposed to be an IOU. It was supposed to be so that we didn't have to trade in all the literal commodities that we might have. So we didn't have to carry bars of gold around for us, for example, when we were operating off the gold standard, or sheep farmers didn't have to carry wool to trade with people who were selling eggs. And the purpose for money is obvious. It's an IOU that's supposed to represent a value. If I sell you 7 oranges for £7, let's say it's £1 an orange, and then in 10 years' time, that £7 wouldn't even get me 1 orange. That's not because the value of oranges has changed that dramatically, although the value, as I say, of different commodities will fluctuate. It won't stay exactly the same, which is why an index currency would serve better than one that was backed by any particular commodity. But the reason why you can only buy 1 orange with your £7 when you could buy 7 oranges however many years ago is because the value of your money has gone down. And when your governments and central banks print more money, they are essentially robbing the value from the money that you already have. And this is really fraudulent and ridiculous. And it's just another example of one of the overtly criminal elements of the societies that we live in, that we just seem to tolerate because it's always been that way for as long as most of us can remember. So I hope that kind of makes sense. The idea I'm presenting, the idea that we should have an index currency, that seems the kind of self-evident idea for how we fix money, what's wrong with our money as it currently is. I mean, obviously fiat money is ridiculous. It's pretty much just like counterfeit money, but we're all forced to use it for the most part. And as such, we end up being robbed through the inflation that our money is subjected to. Whereas we could just as easily have an index currency that always holds the same value. That would be true money. That would be a true currency that would actually serve the purpose of what money and currency is supposed to serve. Now, as I say, from the point of view of the Nations of Sanity project, this is just an idea that people could reject or accept. It's not something that's part of the Nations of Sanity project per se. The Nations of Sanity project, as I said, is only about the idea of establishing the non-aggression principles law, because the non-aggression principle is the only justifiably enforceable law. And that's why this project is built on that certain objective truth, because we can say for certain that the only law, the only standard of law that we can justifiably enforce with force on everybody without violating their rights and freedom is the non-aggression principle, because nobody's rights and freedom extend to the right to violate that principle. So because you don't have the right to violate the non-aggression principle, I'm not violating your rights if I use force to prevent you from violating that principle. It's very simple. Enforcing the non-aggression principles law is defensive force only. It's protecting rights only. And because this principle does outlaw and prohibit any kind of ruling authorities, governments, monarchs, whatever, then the only way to establish this principle as law without contradicting the principle, is to establish it as the terms of peace. So that's what the Nations of Sanity is about. But as I say, once we create a free and sane society, and we assert that the only way to do that is by establishing the non-aggression principle as the terms of peace. When we do that, we still need to have conversations of, okay, well, where do we go from here? Like, what's the best way to have society? Because that just tells the Nations of Sanity project is just about providing the foundation of sanity within which we can build any number of types of societies and live any number of types of lives, some good, some bad. It's as long as we're not violating the non-aggression principle, then we are working within the realm of what we have the right to do and what our freedom extends to. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything we do is going to be a good idea. And the idea of an index currency might not be a good idea. But from what little I understand about blockchain currencies and currencies in general, and from what I understand about inflation, and from what I understand about what everybody really wants a currency to do and represent, which is true value and a stable value, then it seems to me that this is an idea that's worth, at the very least, scrutinizing, if not pursuing. But as I say, it's not something that the Nations of Sanity project is advocating as part of what the Nations of Sanity project is. You know, I want to be very clear about that, because any ideas I present, I don't want to confuse them with the idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as law, because that's the one thing that the Nations of Sanity project is demanding. And that's the one thing I think that we have the right to demand and dictate. The only thing we have the right to demand and dictate is that people don't violate each other. And the non-aggression principle as law is setting those terms of peace for a truly free and sane society. But then once we have that foundation, we need a society that works for the benefit of everybody involved. And obviously, if it doesn't, then at least in a free society, we're free to reject whatever systems don't work for us and pursue the systems that we do want to. And that's the beauty of living in a truly free society. There's no other demand on how we live our lives other than that basic demand that we respect the same basic rights and freedom of individual self-ownership that we all enjoy. So yeah, so that's basically the video in a nutshell. I obviously want to offer the Nations of Sanity up for scrutiny, as I always do. But I also wanted to offer up this other idea of an index currency. And I invite anybody to scrutinize that idea, just as I invite people to scrutinize the basic idea of the Nations of Sanity project. But I also wanted to be very clear to distinguish between the two. The Nations of Sanity project is just about demanding that we make the non-aggression principle the law, so that we can provide everybody with the freedom to pursue the way of life they see fit, and pursue the voluntary collectives and systems that non-coercive systems, obviously, that that they think is the best way for society to organize, and that they want to be part of. And then when we have that foundation, the obvious conversations is to talk about, well, what is the best way to do things? And I think the best way to do money is to have it be indexed, so that these IOUs, which is essentially what money are, what money is, hold a true and stable value. And we can calculate that. That is a doable thing, because we already do it when we calculate inflation. When people tell you that £10 now is worth however many pounds as it was 10 years ago, or when people work out, you know, how inflation is rising, and as I say, for anyone who's got an index pension, that is all calculated based on a cross-section of commodities. That's how we work out a true value. And there is absolutely no reason why we can't base a currency on that system. So an index currency, I believe, is the way to go. And anyone watching this video, please let me know what you think about that idea. And also, please also let me know what you think about the Nations of Sanity project's basic idea, because even though I'm a little bit more certain about that with regards to both the moral truth of it and the logical truth of it, it's all up for scrutiny. And I do sincerely invite people to scrutinize these ideas, because the only way we're going to get to the truth is by helping each other, challenging each other, scrutinizing and supporting these ideas, and letting the best rise to the top, and letting everything that's not worthy fall because it's exposed as not worthy under the scrutiny that reveals whatever cracks and flaws that it might have. So as I say, there may be issues. I'm not an expert on money. I'm not an expert on inflation, but I know the basics, and it seems to me that that inflation is not good for anybody. We don't want it. And if we're going to have a currency, it seems to me that an index currency is a no-brainer. So yes, I'd like to know anyone's thoughts, and I appreciate people listening. Thank you very much.